what's happening is China is the new enemy, the new competitor, economic, political, philosophical. Russia's just a hooligan country. Mm-hmm. Russia needs to be parked. I'm not saying this is my point of view, but I think this is the feeling toward which we're moving. Russia just needs to be parked, and at the moment, Trump is in the business of parking Russia.
In the last 7 days, we've had a presidential bust-up in the White House. President Zelensky's apology, and then some punishment. U.S. military aid stopped to Ukraine, intelligence sharing was withdrawn, and so on. Given the way that the U.S. has been moving away from us under Donald Trump, the U.K. is now being urged to work out how to make our nuclear deterrent truly independent. And the Times has been asking various questions about, whether this is possible, how independent it is, and so on. Our missiles are built and maintained by the U.S. This is, so immensely heavy and frightening stuff, and not really something you want to be talking about while eating bagels. Nonetheless, we are. Matthew, this is just the big picture here. What astonishing questions for us to be asking, whether we can rely on the Americans to preserve our nuclear deterrent. What is going on?
It's not an urgent question. It's maintenance and upgrade and all that kind of thing. They will work without American permission at the moment, but that we should be wondering whether there were circumstances in which we wouldn't get American help. It's quite extraordinary. But that's the way the world is changing. But before our eyes, I am how old? 75. I have never lived in a time when all the apparently fixed certainties of geopolitics were shifting so fast.
Yeah, it's astonishing. I mean, I remember when Trump was first elected in 2016. I remember, doing what everybody did, lying awake at night while that election was going on, thinking about it. And this is what I was scared about. This sort of thing is what I was scared about. And then it didn't happen, and you feel a little bit shrill and ridiculous for having worried in these terms. But Manveen, I mean, this is it. This is happening. This is a change in the structure of the Western world.
It is happening, and I sort of think actually we all owe a debt to the generals he had around him in his first term who stopped this from happening. I don't think it was for want of trying, but now he doesn't have those sensible characters. It really is. I mean, I feel like we still haven't quite woken up to it. Every day feels like such a shock. Yeah. We're still trying to maintain that alliance and hope that Trump will do enough to help us out. But, as Matthew says, we still have a window of opportunity while we can use our nuclear deterrent to work out how we plan for not having American help. That if we don't have those conversations now, I don't know when we will. And to be honest, we should have had the conversation about nuclear a long time ago. It's been renewed again and again without us ever talking about it. I personally think we need a nuclear deterrent, but do we have the right one? For example, we have a continuous at-sea deterrent, which, a lot of people who look at tech will tell you within a couple of years could become pretty redundant because quantum computing is moving so fast, it's going to be able to see everything at the bottom of the ocean within years.
To find our submarines.
In which case,
and we're building new ones.
We've just paid an absolute fortune to build Dreadnought, these huge new submarines. And if they're all visible, that's an extraordinary waste of money. We have no plan B. Nobody seems to be thinking about what happens, given where technology is going. How are we going to work out how to use a nuclear deterrent? And I think part of that has been because we just rely so much on the Americans. Until the Americans have that conversation, we don't have that conversation. So actually, it's an opportunity. We need to be thinking about these things anyway. We need to be working out what we can do with Europe's assistance. France last
Definitely
night.
France. Well, we'll have to do this in
Macron last night
with
already talking about sort of reopening the debate about whether France will be the one that becomes the nuclear backstop for the rest of Europe. I mean, who thought this would happen? Yeah. But, as he pointed out, it all comes down to the will of the French president. And it's fine if it's Macron. What happens if it's Marine Le Pen? Well, we have so many questions.
She's been surprisingly robust over the last few weeks. Matthew, one hesitates to call this existential. That's too big. But we are at a moment. I don't know, it's like we have to decide right now what sort of country we are. Because we've talked a lot about national decline for decades now. Britain no longer has the role in the world it once did. This is the point where we have to decide whether we want to try and get it back to the extent that we can, or whether we just accept not having it and, become a country like, I don't want to get old J.D. Vance about this, but become a country more like Denmark.
I think it's even bigger than that, and it isn't really just about us. I woke up in the small hours of this morning, and you have those sudden, very vivid ideas. They seem so strong. In the morning, you think, am I just going crazy? But it struck me that what's happening is China is the new enemy, the new competitor, economic, political, philosophical. Russia's just a hooligan country. Mm-hmm. Russia needs to be parked. I'm not saying this is my point of view, but I think this is the feeling toward which we're moving. Russia just needs to be parked, and at the moment, Trump is in the business of parking Russia. Europe's almost irrelevant to all of this.
Yeah, but I mean, why should Europe? I mean, Europe is the wealthiest region of the world. You know, the abandonment. Okay, another way to ask this question: the abandonment of American influence in Europe is quite rude to Europe. But it also seems to me to be short-sighted. If America didn't have influence in Europe, it would want it. If America didn't have influence in Europe, it would drive Donald Trump mad that there was this continent that could just ignore him and carry on by itself, wouldn't it? I
think it's incredibly short-sighted. You know, none of this is new. Rugged individualism for the Americans isn't new. You know, they don't do history enough, I think. They always think that they're reinventing the wheel. This has happened before. The reason they ended up with all the alliances and all the responsibilities around the world they did was because of the Second World War, when they were under attack and they understood what that meant. And you understand what alliances mean. At the moment, they are going around jeopardising all of theirs. They're turning their back on us. They're turning their back on NATO, seemingly, at a time when, actually, Russia and China have watched NATO. They've watched the UN. They've watched all the sort of alliances they feel they don't get in. I mean, the UN they have a bit more of a voice on, but, the ones that they don't have a say in, they see as a threat. They've watched them for decades and they felt threatened by them. They've started building their own. They've started building BRICS, trying to make that something which actually holds, which is just as strong an alliance as the ones that the West has, at a time where Trump, if he is genuinely worried about China or Russia, Russia is doing deals with the North Koreans for troops, with the Iranians for weapons. Trump is cutting off all of the alliances he has, all of the support he has militarily and in terms of trade and relationships. It just seems completely mad. As an isolationist country, I don't think that's going to make America great again. It actually just means that the unipolar world is completely over and China is a much stronger competitor.
The alliance between China and Russia is fairly delicate, I think, and historically it's not very deep-rooted. And I think the aim may be also to split Russia from China. And if I'm right about this being the new way people are thinking, then it isn't really Trump. He's just the messenger of an idea that is arriving, and unfortunately the idea may survive him.
Is there a bit of you, Matthew, that I know you don't approach politics generally in an emotional way, I understand that, but a bit of, when you look at your former fellow travellers, shall we say, on the American right, and that whole tradition that Britain and America particularly, never mind the rest of Europe, they're important too, but never mind the rest of Europe, Britain and America, that whole special relationship, Athens to their Rome type thing, how little they seem to care about us and our security. Is there a bit of that hurts on a personal level? Yes,
there's also a bit that gives me some rather illicit pleasure, in that I always found the hard-line Atlanticists in the Conservative Party very annoying. Right. I found their absolute faith that America was the thing, Europe didn't matter, nothing mattered, just our friendship with America. They must be feeling really confused now, and I'm enjoying that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very bad for reform if you think about it. The only sort of real policy they're known for is their closeness to Trump, and that's not a good look right now.
But there's a whole mindset that is all about America being the answer, and America caring so little about us. It's like that story about what Donald Trump's son not actually knowing who Nigel Farage was, which whether or not it was true felt like it should have been true. But it's the disdain there that you'd think has to have an impact on our politics. It's very,
it's not entirely new either. We talk about the special relationship and have done for decades. Americans much less so.
Right.
They're not as fussed about it. I remember being in the Pentagon, and they, around the time Brexit was happening, and they sort of said, "What's the point of you? We thought you were sort of our bridge into Europe. If you're not that anymore, what's the point of you?" There was no warm words about this enduring special relationship and the characters who put it together. none of that. I
We've
think
been
the history
cursed,
matters.
I think, by sharing a language with the Americans and have assumed that they're just our cousins and we're all on the same side.
Yeah, which is not a sentiment that lasts long in America. Much as I love going to America and love Americans, one can often feel that Americans are more foreign than Europeans, despite the language barrier in many kind of ways. Talking about the special relationship, let's talk briefly about our other special relationship, maybe the one we have in the afternoons with the French. How is that going to change, do you think? Because Starmer and Macron are the absolute sort of, trying to shift into this sort of dual role of global leadership. Is that going to just redefine who we are in the world, or is that just going to, I don't know, is that just going to look a bit sort of impersonator-ish?
No, I think it's a new, and it's going to be quite a strong thing. Just take your mind back to the Brexit wars, and if anyone had suggested that our future was a closer partnership with France, maybe even sharing nuclear weapons with France, everyone would have thrown their hands up in horror. Even Remainers would have been embarrassed by the thought. But now I think we see, and we must begin to see, France as our most important partner on the other side of the Channel.
Is it fundamentally possible, though, to have a European military alliance that we're in, but because the reason why NATO works is because NATO has a dominant partner, and you have the President of the United States, who is the Commander-in-Chief of NATO, and to have a completely a democratic military alliance among many, many states, is that feasible?
We've got to hope it is.
Yeah.
And I think Matthew's right. If you think of the culture change, the idea of a European army was one of the reasons people were very pro-Brexit.
Yeah.
And yet now it just feels like it's the only thing that will save us. There will be huge problems. There are bits of Europe that we would struggle to agree with, like Hungary right now, who are massively pro-Russia, seem to have very different values. Language is still a barrier, and not just, obviously there are translators at all the meetings, but soldiers, when you're fighting alongside each other, it just makes it slightly harder. I know that happens with NATO already, but it does mean that you end up, basically having to specialise and use people in different places. Working out how we function together is going to be key.
Yeah.
So, we know we can't rebuild our defence. If we expect America not to step up on our own, we're going to need to specialise in some things and expect other bits of Europe to specialise in others.
You're so right.
Yeah.
And just a few years ago, the very expression European army would have even Remainers casting their eyes, oh, for heaven's sake, not that.
Yeah, that'll never happen.
Yes,
that old nonsense. Yeah, indeed. Let's talk a little bit about domestic politics. Changes to sentencing guidelines are taking effect next month. That's guidance given to judges, which now says that judges should consider whether an offender was from an ethnic, cultural or religious minority when deciding whether or not to impose a custodial or community sentence. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, spoke to Times Radio Breakfast about this morning.
Many, many people in this country would be appalled by that, because it does set up a situation where other groups, such as straight white men, are demonstrably being treated differently in the legal system. And I worry that public trust and confidence is fraying in our criminal justice system, and then this will just further erode it.
Well, Matthew, what do you think?
I think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup. Judges have always taken these things into consideration, and it isn't always wrong that you need to know more about the individual before you tailor the sentence to the individual. Barristers have pleas in mitigation before the sentence is handed down. My client has just got his first job, and his girlfriend is pregnant. All that kind of stuff. It does seem a little bit odd that judges should now be required to commission this sort of research when I assume it will be put before them anyway. But I don't think it's wrong that we look at the circumstances, perhaps the ethnicity, perhaps the gender of the accused person, and before we decide what the right punishment would be.
Do you know, I can sort of understand. There's bits of this that I can understand more than other bits. I can completely understand why you'd obviously think very carefully about putting a transgender prisoner into a jail, for example, because that creates all kinds of complications about which jail they go to. I'm not sure I quite get the logic of this or the ethics of this, but on an ethnic minority basis. Okay.
I think it's a really clumsy attempt to recognise that there are, the criticism from Robert Jenrick this morning is that it's creating a two-tier system. There already is a two-tier system, and I think it's a really clumsy attempt to try and fix that. And I just think they're approaching it from the wrong end. Actually, it's the laws that exist on sentencing, which are already in place and don't disappear with this, that probably need to be addressed. So, for example, last year I went and interviewed a woman in Wiltshire who had the most horrendous experience. She'd come home to find her teenage daughter, stabbed on the kitchen floor multiple times in a frenzied attack. Her boyfriend was sent to prison for a couple of years. Had he been a black teenager found in London with a knife, without even necessarily using it, he would have been in prison for much longer. And the sentencing is deliberately written. I mean, they were told when they went to try and sort of get this looked at and sort of try to get a sense of justice, they were told that the sentencing is designed so that black teenagers in London are sort of, they're hoping it's a deterrent, but either way, you're ending up with a lot of black teenagers in London being put behind bars for much longer because they've got a knife. I don't think this will solve that. And in the meantime, there is a danger that it just gives people the sense, J.D. Vance will be on it in a second, saying this is two-tier care. Britain, sort of gives advantages to people who aren't Christians. And I think that's all sort of not massively helpful. I mean, and it does sort of, it slightly patronises people who are from ethnic minorities who don't commit crimes. That's not a necessary, the mitigation is something else, isn't it? The mitigation, as Matthew says, is something the judge is probably already thinking about. Was this as a result of, aggravated abuse? Was this, what was the thing that actually motivated them to commit the crime? It might have been inspired by their ethnicity or their gender, but the thing was probably the bullying or the attacks that they were receiving, whatever it was that triggered them. And I feel like by taking it all the way back to their ethnicity, it just becomes, it's not massively helpful.
Well, I mean, as things stand, just the research that a lot of these changes were based on, black offenders are less likely to receive a community order, which means they're more likely to go to jail than white offenders. So when people talk about, as Manveen says, when people talk about two-tier justice, we already have two-tier justice, just not in the way that the people who are complaining about it complain.
So many problems are caused by writing things down. We do all kinds of things just flying by the seat of our pants and using our intuition. In any school classroom, for instance, the teacher may know there's a little boy or girl at the back who needs special attention, give them more attention than the other pupils. But were you to write it down, people would get angry. Positive discrimination in many ways has always been practiced, always will be. But the moment you try to reduce it to written instructions, I think you're just going to make people angry.
On the subject of prisons, Matt, you've been writing in the Times today about imprisonment for public protections, or IPPs. Can you remind us what they are?
Yes, in 2005, David Blunkett, when he was Home Secretary, brought in a new kind of sentence, indeterminate prison for public protection. And the idea was that some people, although the crime that they have committed may attract only a small sentence, nevertheless, they're obviously a great danger to society and they should stay behind bars until it's determined that they're capable of behaving properly and coming back out again. The judiciary greatly misused this and started handing them down to almost everybody. And the long and the short of it is there are still in prison, though IPPs were abolished in 2012, I think, by Kenneth Clarke. They didn't let the people out that were already in, and they're still in. There have been more than 100 suicides.
I mean, they're in jail because what? Because whatever parole hearing type thing they have to go through keeps judging them not fit for release.
Yes, and I mustn't disparage the work that the probation officers do. One has just written to me, actually, this morning. I mean, the probation service, the parole board, and all the rest really try. But the trouble is, if you've been in prison, the guy I was talking about was 24 when he committed the crime. He's just come out today, in fact. If you've been in prison with never knowing when you're going to get out, you become troublesome. You become disturbed, and a lot of them have. And some of them, probably, it would be hard to release at all now. They're so institutionalised.
I mean, prisons are one of these areas, whenever you sort of peel back the surface, look what's happening underneath, it's one horror after another.
I was genuinely horrified when I read Matthew's column about this. It was something I wasn't aware of. And, the example that you gave of somebody who, in anger, through this sort of homemade explosive effect, but it didn't damage anybody. They were in for a few years, and they're still in now.
Yes,
after almost 20.
He was
That's
24
insane.
when he went in, and I think he's 42 or 43 now.
I mean, that's an entire life wasted.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that was happening, but it's one of those moments when you realise that we have a system like that makes you wonder who we are.
Yeah, I think
That's how you judge a society, surely.
Now it's the time of the week where we listen very carefully to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
And I would strongly recommend Hugo Rifkin in the Times today.
Thanks, old chum. My column in the Times today is about the story, the notion that people in Europe appear to be boycotting Teslas. Car buyers are no longer buying Elon Musk's car. There are also boycotts in Canada against American goods. My point is that this sort of boycott is not the kind of old-fashioned ethical boycott like we used to see, like boycotting South African origins in the 1980s, for example. This is self-preservation. People are boycotting these things because Trump's America wants to hurt their economies, and so there's an extremely rational reason for consumers fighting back, and yet I'm not really sure that consumers generally, being one, have the sticking power to do so. Manveen, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we are suddenly such a consumer-driven nation. You know, in your column you talked about Amazon. I've done the same. I've often thought I must stop using Amazon, and then it's just so convenient and it's so much easier. And I fear that it'll probably be the same with this. I mean, Tesla is interesting. I think it is much more avoidable than Amazon.
It's really easy not to
It's
buy
really easy not to buy one.
car.
I haven't yet.
Yeah.
Partly because I don't drive, but that's a whole other thing. But you know,
Well, they'll drive themselves soon.
they'll drive themselves soon. I'm waiting for that. But I you know, as you pointed out in your column, what I'm really interested in, though, is will Americans who are pro-Trump suddenly sort of pick up the slack? Will they start buying Teslas to be supportive?
Yeah,
Which
that
would
is
be
interesting.
great.
Yeah.
It might sort of offset some of the environmental impact of drill, baby, drill.
But why not? You know, I think it's a good thing if customers use their own feelings about the sources of things to guide their decisions what to purchase. It's always going to be a bit random. It's always going to be a bit illogical, inconsistent. I've got a printout here from a website, Stronger Europe by European, and they have a list of the things we should avoid from America and the things we should consider
wow.
instead.
Oh, I love it.
Let me just read the first one. Avoid from America, Facebook, X, Instagram, Reddit. Consider instead Spond, Mastodon, Pixelfed, Be Real, and Lemmy.
I'm pretty online, and I've only heard of one of those.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I mean, that did happen. People did leave X because of
Yeah.
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And went to the American-owned Blue Sky instead.
Yeah, yes, that wasn't
I'm
quite
wondering about my Starlink connection now. You know, should I be using Starlink if Musk won't let the Ukrainians use it?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think Matthew's right. In a world where we are suddenly seeing the tectonic plates of everything sort of shifting in a way that we have never known, and we have so little control, you know, we can't suddenly turn around and buy ourselves a nuclear deterrent tomorrow. What we can do as individuals is actually this. This is the only way we can try and make a difference to what's happening. You know, the little power we have is how we decide to use our money individually.
And I think we're conditioned to think this is petty, this is small, this is virtue signalling when you're talking about consumer boycotts. But you look at Canada, you know, and I mentioned this in the column. You got Justin Trudeau saying at the weekend what they are trying to do, they being the Trump administration, what they are trying to do is destroy our economy so we're easier to annex. In that situation, of course you want to boycott American goods, don't you?
And as you say in your column, what's wrong with virtue signalling?
Well,
it's better than the alternative.
Exactly.
Also, you know, when tariffs come along, it may just end up being economically the better thing to do to avoid American goods, because they'll be so much more expensive. The tariffs are two-way. I did think I hadn't come across it, but in your column you talked about people now calling the Tesla the swastika.
Swastika.
Which I hadn't come across
Swastika, very
before.
good,
My
yeah.
personal favourite so far, because, you know, the world may be falling apart, but the memes have never been so good.
Exactly.
I loved the Trump administration being described as the Nerd Reich. That was very good.
That is good. If a little strong, perhaps. Is it? I don't know.
Is it though?